Ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome is uncommon but serious complications associated with controlled ovarian stimulation during assisted reproductive technologies. Coming to definition, it is a iatrogenic complication of controlled ovarian stimulation. It is rarely seen in natural conception. So OHSS consists of ovarian enlargement accompanied by an overproduction of ovarian hormones and ovarian vasoactive substance, which alone or in concert may produce hyperpermeability state responsible for the signs, symptoms, and complications of OHSS. So mild forms of OHSS is seen in 33% of the ART procedures. Moderate to severe forms are seen in 0.2 to 2% of the cases. The death rate is around 3 per 1 lakh. There are different ways to classify this OHSS. So many definitions has come up. So here I'm discussing very few which are important. One is early onset OHSS and the other is the late onset OHSS. Early onset is because we are administering HCG injection as a trigger or a luteal phase support like that. It is mainly because of exogenous HCG which is administered. So it appears between 3 to 7 days of HCG trigger. It depends upon the ovarian stimulation, like patients, what is her AFC, what is her BMI and AMH value, and how much dose we have used during stimulation and how many follicles have developed, and also like what is the dose of HCG which is given. Depending upon that, the severity may vary in early onset OHSS. Late onset OHSS is related to conception. It is mainly because of placental HCG. It usually occurs after 10 days, more than 10 days of HCG trigger. It is independent of stimulation. It is more severe and it is persistent, and it is difficult to predict also regarding this late onset OHSS. So coming to the classification, which is based on the severity. This was proposed by Rabu in 1967. So here he divided OHSS into 6 grades. So in grade 1, the clinical feature and lab criteria are, so 24 hours urinary excretion, like they have monitored, and also the E2 value more than 150 microgram, and also pregnenolone value more than 10 milligram. Management is mainly by byproducts of ovarian stimulations, doesn't require attention or observation. Grade 2 is grade 1 plus presence of enlarged ovaries. In grade 1 only the hormones are increased, and in grade 2 there is presence of enlarged ovaries, and they have mentioned no observation is required. Actually this is the older classification, we don't follow much. Grade 3 is presence of abdominal distension and also definitely palpable ovarian cyst. So here the management is possible risk of future worsening and it requires observation. Grade 4, the patient will have symptoms like nausea, vomiting and possible diarrhea. So it requires observation. And in grade 5, we can see there is a fluid shift to the third space. So patient will have ascites and hydrothorax. It requires hospitalization, aggressive observation and intervention. Grade 6 is hematological changes in the blood volume, blood viscosity, and coagulation time. In grade 6, patient will have emo concentration and they can land up in DIC and other complications. Here they require hospitalization as well as intervention. So here they have told grade 1 and grade 2 are mild forms, grade 3 and 4 are moderate, grade 5 and grade 6 are severe. In 1989, Golan et al., they proposed another classification in which grade 1 is a mild form where the patient complains of abdominal discomfort and distension. Grade 2 also is a mild form where the ovaries are enlarged between 5 to 12 centimeter and they present with nausea, vomiting and diarrhea. Grade 3 is moderate, that is ultrasound evidence of ascites is there. Grade 4 is severe form where patient presents with respiratory symptoms and clinical evidence of ascites and hydrothorax. Grade 5 is severe, that is there is a hemoconcentration, hypotension, oliguria due to increased blood viscosity and also coagulation abnormality like DIC can set in. And in 1992, Novet et al., they proposed this, like mild, moderate, severe, critical. So majority of us follow this. In the mild form, patient will have bloating sensation and they will have nausea, abdominal distension. The size of the ovaries will be less than 5 centimeter. In moderate form, patient will have vomiting, patient will have abdominal pain, and also in USG there is evidence of ascites, and also the size of the ovaries will be more than 5 centimeter. Hematocrit will be more than 41%, and also WBC more than 10,000. In severe form, the patient will have third space fluid loss, which presents in the form of massive ascites. Patient will have hydrothorax and they will have respiratory symptoms like breathing difficulties and all. And you can hear basal crepitations and everything will be there. Here, hematocrit will be more than 45%, and also WBC count will be more than 15,000. And also there is changes in the creatinine levels also between 1 to 1.5 milligram per deciliter, and also creatinine clearance more than 50 ml per minute. And also patient may present with hepatic dysfunction, NSRK, and ovaries are variably enlarged. So critical patients are, they present with very acute symptoms like tense ascites, and they will have hypoxia, and also pericardial effusion can happen, and also hematocrit value more than 55%. We can see so much of hemoconcentration is happening in critical cases. And also WBC concentration will be more than 25,000, and patient will have the renal impairment, they will have DIC features, and also patient presents with oliguria or anuria, creatinine value more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter, and clearance will be less than 50 ml per minute, creatinine clearance. And also patient presents with renal failure, they will have thromboembolism, and also they presents with ARDS symptoms, and ovaries are very enlarged. So, and also the other classifications are risk ablogs. This is proposed in 1994. It is not commonly used just for the completions like I've just mentioned here. They divided into grade A, B, and C. Grade A presents with dyspnea, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and also they will have clinical and ultrasound evidence of ascites, hydrothorax, and enlarged ovaries on ultrasound. And here the biochemical parameters will be normal. In grade B, what happens? There is a third space fluid loss. They will have ascites, enlarged ovaries, severe dyspnea, and severe oliguria. And also biochemical profile like increased hematocrit value, hepatic dysfunction, elevated serum creatinine. Grade C is end organ failure, renal failure, venous thromboembolism, and ARDS. So if you remember two classification, that is early onset and late onset, and also this NOVAT classification which was proposed in 1992, that is mild, moderate, severe, critical, that is more than sufficient. So coming to the etiology of OHSS. So mainly it is because of HCG. HCG plays a key role in the etiopathogenesis, which releases vascular endothelial growth factor. So coming to the etiopathogenesis, mainly because when we give the HCG, so when we give the exogenous HCG, if the dose is more, it may have a long half-life. Half-life will be more, and also increased HCG signals with FSH receptors. They act on that also. And also HCG injection endogenously can also increase whenever there is a multiple gestation, like twins, triplets, and all. So, and also if there is if the FSH dose is more, there is development of multiple follicles. So multiple follicles, multiple gestations, and also more dose of exogenous HCG, what happens? There is a high vascular endothelial, high secretions of the vascular endothelial follicle. So, and also some patient may have a genetic predisposition where the vascular endothelial growth factor secretion may be more. So what happens? More follicles, more HCG, so there is more VEGF secretions. So all this VEGF, what it does on the vessels is, it goes and acts on the VEGF receptors on the blood vessels. So by acting on that, what they cause is they increase the vascular permeability. So what happens? There is a fluid shift from the blood vessels to the third space, like abdominal cavity, pleural cavity, and also in the pericardial cavities. So the fluid starts getting shifted to that places, so resulting in OHSS. So, and also there may be in some patient may have mutation in the VEGF receptors. So in those patients, even with the minimal dose of HCG, they may have severe forms of OHSS. So all of you, can you just unmute?
Doctors, please mute yourself. It's very disturbing.
Yeah. Whoever has unmuted, please mute yourself.
I think it is Dr. Netravati and Dr. Suchita, Sri Lekha, Rajesh, Vanajakshi. Please mute yourself. Yes, ma'am. Please carry on. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, what are the other factors which leads to ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome? These are mainly vasoactive peptides. One most important is vascular endothelial growth factor. The others are insulin-like growth factor and PDGF, that is platelet-derived growth factors, prostaglandins, and also TGF and angiotensin 2, interleukin 1, 6, and 8. All these factors also plays an important role in the onset of OHSS. So mainly there is a ovarian stimulation, release of vasoactive substance. So these vasoactive substance, they increase the angiogenesis, they cause capillary changes, and also there is increase in capillary permeability. So increased capillary permeability results in ovarian and systemic pathophysiological changes resulting in ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So because of increased capillary and also increased capillary permeability results in hypovolemia. There is a decrease in the fluid in the blood vessels. There is hypovolemia and also increased fluid collections in the abdominal cavity as well as pleural cavity. So resulting in third space fluid accumulation, resulting in tense ascites, pleural effusion. In severe cases, pericardial effusion can also happen. So because of hypovolemia, patient presents with oliguria, azotemia, and also electrolyte imbalance. And also they may land up with hypovolemic shock, and also there is hemoconcentration resulting in thrombosis. So this slide explains all the complications which happens mainly because of increased vascular permeability. So because of third space fluid accumulation, patient will have pleural effusion, pericardial effusion, and ascites. And because of hypovolemia, patient will have decreased BP, hypovolemic shock. There is a hemoconcentration. Thereby, there is increase in hematocrit value. There is increase in WBC's count, and also patient presents with thrombosis. Later, they will go for DIC. And also because of hypovolemia, patient will have renal impairment. Initially, they starts with oliguria, increased creatinine, and also decrease in creatinine clearance, and also they will end up with renal failure. And also electrolyte imbalances can also happen. So it is better predict the OHSS early before all these complications sets in. So coming to high E2 level and OHSS, estradiol itself doesn't have any direct vasoactivity, but it upregulates the CFTR expression. So there is increased channel activity in the peritoneal cavity, fluid shift, and ascites. That's why there is no like increased estradiol does not directly act on the vessels. It upregulates the CFTR gene expressions, which in turn increases the channel activity in the peritoneal cavity, and fluid shift happens and ascites can happen. That's why like whenever there is an increased E2, we take certain measures to reduce the value as early as possible. So coming to the symptoms of OHSS. So what are the symptoms? Most frequent symptoms are they will complain of nausea, vomiting, and lower abdominal distension. These are the first symptoms which they present. So you have to grab that as early as possible and start treating it. Few patients may present with diarrhea, and in severe cases they will present with like dyspnea, respiratory distress, and also increased weight gain. So, and as the symptoms increases and worsens, they may present with ascites, hypotension, oliguria, anuria, and they will have pleural effusion, pericardial effusion, thromboembolism symptoms, ARDS, and multiple organ failures. So coming to the lab values. So one is they will have features of hypovolemia. They will have, when we do the CBC, we can see that hemoglobin concentration may vary, and also hematocrit concentration starts increasing. And also we can see leukocytosis. There is increase in WBC count, and also the electrolytes may vary. Mainly they presents with hyponatremia and hyperkalemia. And creatinine clearance and serum creatinine level may start increasing, and also clearance may renal function, that is creatinine clearance may start reducing. And also they may present when we check the liver function test, they may have hypoproteinemia as well as hypoalbuminemia, and also there is elevated liver enzymes. and also they will have hypercoagulability. So the additional complications may be like they may present with ovarian torsion. All of a sudden they will have acute pain abdomen because ovaries are enlarged and they undergo torsion, resulting in severe pain. And also like there will be like the luteal cyst formation after OPO. So this cyst can rupture and there may be bleeding also. So and also the bleeding can happen inside the ovary, intra-ovarian bleeding resulting in increased ovarian volume, or the bleeding can happen inside the peritoneal cavity resulting in hemoperitoneum also. And thromboembolic complications, most commonly the venous thromboembolic complications are most common compared to arterial, and 83% of these occurs in the neck, arm, head veins. So coming to the risk factor, which are the people who go for OHSs? One is high risk and the others are low risk categories. High risk categories are young females. So, and polycystic appearing ovaries, and also those who are asthenic habitus, very thin patients, and high estradiol value. In the ART, more than 4,000, and in ovulation induction, if it is more than 1,700 itself. And also multiple stimulated follicles in ART more than 20, and in ovulation induction more than 6. And also in the ultrasound, if there is a necklace sign, that is especially in the PCO patients, and also in the pregnancies. And HCG, whenever we use HCG as a luteal supplementation, whenever the more number of follicles are developed during ovulation induction, and after giving HCG trigger, again if we use HCG for luteal phase supplementations to increase the support, they may land up with OHSs. And also whenever there is a GnRH agonist down-regulated protocol, so especially when a PCO patient, when we are using GnRH agonist down-regulated protocol, here if the more follicles develops, we have to give HCG as the trigger. So that is one of the high risk factor. And also if the patient AMH value is more, those are the high risk patients who can go in for OHSs. The low risk patients are older patients because their AMH will be less, AFCs will be less, and also those who are hypogonadotropic, heavily built. And if the estradiol value is less and poor response to gonadotropins and few antral follicles, those who have elevated baseline FSH, progesterone or no luteal support, only when progesterone is used for luteal phase support, or if there is no luteal phase support is given, they are for low risk. And also whenever we use clomiphene citrate or HMG protocol, here we can expect 1 or 2 follicle develop, multiple follicle developments are very less. So what are the other associations with OHSs? What are the other things which can lead to OHS? One is if there is any FSH receptor mutations. So what happens even if we give a lower dose of FSH, they may hyper respond. Or when the TSH, those who have high TSH values, and few studies have noted those who have blood group A, they will have more tendency towards OHSs. And also if they have any adenoma which is secreting gonadotropins, they may also land up in OHSs. So there are another one terminology that is called as spontaneous OHSs. So D-linear classified into one is type 1, type 2 and type 3. Type 1 is mainly because of mutated FSH receptors. So they undergo recurrent spontaneous ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Even with CC, even with letrozole, they may have multiple follicle development. They will have recurrent spontaneous OHSs. And usually it will be of mild forms. So type 2 are whenever there is a high HCG values in the body, especially when the patient has multiple gestations or if they have identiform mole. So type 3 is whenever there is a hypothyroidism, like whenever there is a high TSH values. So coming to the preventions, like what are the primary preventions and what are the secondary preventions? So primary prevention mainly is whenever you are doing the stimulation, proper selection of the patient, you have to categorize them whether they are low risk or high risk, and also depending upon that, and also the stimulations. These are very much important. So whenever you are using a gonadotropin, always start with a lower dose of gonadotropins. And if the patient is a PCO patient, always follow a chronic low dose step-up protocol in a PCO patients. And also mild stimulation protocols can be used in a PCO patients. So, and also administration of FSH is delayed until the mid or late follicular phase, especially when you are doing ovulation induction with clomiphene citrate or letrose. Instead of starting FSH, especially on day 3, day 4 only, you can start between seeing the response, you can start from day 6, day 7 onwards. And also always we can do it, we can reduce the risk by using a antagonist based protocols. And also another important factor is avoiding HCG for luteal phase support. Whenever you are seeing it as a high risk patient for developing OHSS, don't use HCG for a luteal phase support. And also using in vitro maturation for PCO patients where risk of OHSS is there. So this IVM is not widely used owing to reduced live birth rate compared to conventional IVF. So coming to, I'll just discuss few the Cochrane reviews about what are the different methods and what is the evidence in preventing the OHSS. Coming to the Cochrane review on antagonist protocol. So here the author's main conclusion is antagonist protocol is a short and simple protocol with a good clinical outcome with significant reduction in the incidence of OHSS and the amount of gonadotropin, but the lower pregnancy rate compared to GnRH agonist long protocol necessitates counseling sub-fertile couple before recommending changes for GnRH agonist to antagonist. This was the earlier Cochrane review where they have told pregnancy rates were less with antagonist compared to agonist. It is not like that. It is now almost, it is similar. So that's why whenever there is a high risk patients for OHSS, it is better we use an antagonist protocol rather than using a GnRH agonist long protocol and all. So here here in this Cochrane, they had done 27 randomized control trials where they have compared GnRH antagonist cycle versus long GnRH agonist cycles. So the clinical pregnancy rates were significantly lower in the antagonist protocol, and the ongoing pregnancy live birth rate showed the same significant lower pregnancy rate in the antagonist group also. However, there was statistical significant reduction in the incidence of OHSS with antagonist protocol. So here it is 27 RCTs comparing antagonist versus agonist, long agonist protocols. So coming to the secondary prevention. So in the secondary prevention, it is mainly by one is what are the things we can do in the secondary preventions. I will explain each and everything later. So one is if you are feeling that whenever you're doing ovarian stimulation for TI cycle, timed intercourse or IUI cycle, if you feel they are hyper responded, it is better to cancel the cycle. And also withhold the HCG trigger. Don't give HCG trigger whenever you are suspecting high risk. And also the other features are coasting, the GnRH agonist trigger, recombinant LH trigger, and freeze all the embryos, don't go for fresh transfers, and other medications like metformin, use of cabergoline, and IV albumin, steroids, and also HES, starch, and also luteal phase letrose and low dose aspirin. So coming to the each methods, one is coasting. Coasting, what is the principle when we have to do this coasting? So coasting is done whenever the E2 value is more than 4,500 picogram per ml. So if more than 20 follicles are developing per ovary, so gonadotropin dose is decreased or stopped. So continuing, so whenever you are doing a high wave stimulation, whether if it is an agonist cycle or an antagonist cycle, what we do is we will give, if it is an agonist cycle, we will continue giving agonist. If it is an antagonist cycle, we will give only antagonist. We try to avoid giving either recombinant FSH or HMG. Don't give recombinant FSH or HMG for 2 or 3 days. Just give only agonist or antagonist. By doing this, what happens, the larger follicles continue to grow, whereas the intermediate or small follicles, they undergo atresia. So whenever you are seeing more number of intermediate follicles, you can do the coasting. So what are the evidence for coasting? By doing coasting, by withholding the gonadotropins, it causes downregulation of VEGF gene expression and protein production as a result of increased apoptosis in the granulosa cells of all, but mainly immature follicles. So without the influence on the oocyte quality and endometrial receptivity. By doing coasting, what we do is here the immature follicles and all, they undergo atresia. And also there is down regulation of VEGF gene expression as well as protein production. So by this, what happens? The number of follicles, only the larger one, they grow, but only few follicles they grow. So the E2 value is also less, and VEGF levels are also less, and chances of OHSS is also less. By doing coasting, usually it will not affect the oocyte quality, and it will also not affect the endometrial receptivity. So the practical guidelines for starting the coasting is whenever the E2 value is more, when estradiol value is more than 4,500, and when E2 value is more than 150 picogram per follicle, like E2 production is more than 150 picogram per follicle between 16 to 18 mm. If you see like 15 to 30 mature follicles are there, that is if 15 to 30 follicles measuring between 16 to 18 mm are there, it is better you do coasting. So measure estradiol on the daily basis. Do not skip any day to avoid sudden unexpected drops. So whenever you are doing coasting daily, you have to measure the estradiol value. So give HCG 5000 or GnRH agonist when estradiol falls to less than 3500. So when the value is less, we start measuring the estradiol value. Continue either agonist or antagonist only. Don't give gonadotropins only. So for trigger, especially usually we go for agonist trigger. Suppose if the follicles are less and if you have to give HCG trigger, it should be only 5000, not more than that. So, and also only when the E2 value is less than 3500, you can use HCG trigger. Otherwise, better to go for GnRH agonist trigger. So when we have to stop this coasting, so coasting has to be stopped when estradiol concentration rises to 6,500, more than 30 mature follicle develops, and coasting takes more than 4 days. Usually, ideally, we do between 1 or 3 days of coasting we do. Suppose if we cannot do coasting for more than 4 days, and also like if more than 30 mature follicles are there, and also if E2 value is more than 6,500, usually we go for give the agonist trigger and do the oocyte pickup and finish off the procedure early rather than waiting more. So what is the Cochrane review on coasting? Coasting, that is withholding the gonadotropins for preventing ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So the author's conclusion was there is a lack of randomized controlled trials comparing coasting with no coasting or other interventions such as embryo freezing or intravenous albumin infusion for prevention of OHSS. There is insufficient evidence to determine whether coasting is an effective strategy for prevention of OHSS. So here there are so many, like it lacks mainly to conclude this coasting as an important method. Majority of the studies were not comparative studies. So they have not compared like coasting without coasting or coasting with any other interventions like that. They have not compared the groups. They have not compared the intervention. That's why like it is difficult, if we collect all the data, it's difficult to recommend that coasting is very effective. We have to do in all cases. But in whatever the study they have done, they have shown it is beneficial. But still larger randomized control trials and comparative studies are required. What are the disadvantages of coasting? One is it does not completely prevent the OHSS. Only thing is it can reduce the severity, but it will not completely prevent the OHSS. Some follicles are lost, resulting in decreased number of the oocyte retrieved. And few studies have noted like it may affect the endometrial receptivity because we are extending the duration of the stimulation, and also it might it might affect the endometrial receptivity. Few studies have noted it. So only is like to prevent the increased E2 value, to prevent increased VEGF, to prevent the severity, we can just use coasting for 1 or 2 days, but it will not completely prevent the OHSS. So now coming to the like using HCG. So everyone will have in mind, okay, if OHSS is one of the complication mainly by HCG, what should be the optimal dose of HCG? So many meta-analysis has been done. One of the meta-analysis have taken. So women, if the women with previous history of OHSS, high peak estradiol concentration, and women with PCO could have an adequate response even with a low dose HCGs only. The good responders need not receive a higher dose higher than 5,000. poor responder would probably benefit from a higher dose of HCG. The dose of HCG should be individualized. So in this meta-analysis, they have compared like what should be the dose of HCG for different categories of patients. So the different categories are poor responders, good, that is normal responders, or a PCO patients. So they have told only like, or the dose of HCG always should be individualized. So it depends on patient to patient. We cannot generalize it. So only in case of poor responder patients, if you are using HCG as a trigger, probably in poor responders, you may give more dose. That is, you can give 7,500 or 10,000 IU of HCG. But in a normal responder, up to 5,000 is sufficient. But in a patient who has already had a previous history of OHSS and who had a high peak estradiol concentration, whose E2 value is more, and those who are polycystic ovary patients, less than 5,000 is also sufficient. They will respond to a lower dose of HCG. It is better to avoid HCG in those patients. Even if you are giving, if you want to give it at a lower dose, not more doses. So, and another one question we will have, whether urinary HCG is better or a recombinant HCG is a better. So there is no difference in the clinical outcome of live birth or ongoing pregnancy or miscarriage rate and OHSS. So, and also few studies have noted there is a significantly increased incidence of local injection site adverse effect with urinary HCGs. So when we compare the pregnancy rates and ongoing rates, both are same, whether you are using a urinary product or a recombinant product. So only thing is, by using urinary product, the local site injections or allergic reactions may be more. So another question which comes in our mind is using GnRH agonist versus HCG as a trigger whenever we are suspecting OHSS. So the GnRH agonist trigger, it induces both endogenous LH and FSH surge similar to natural menstrual cycle. It causes complete and quick luteolysis, quick reversibility of antagonist-induced pituitary suppression. There is no sustained release of ovarian steroids after GnRH agonist administration. The non-steroidal luteal function markers like inhibin A and pro-alpha sharply declined, and also adequate LH surge for final. It also gives adequate LH surge for the final oocyte maturation. So by giving, whenever you are suspecting OHSS, you can use GnRH antagonist trigger, because with GnRH antagonist trigger, the chances of OHSS is very less. So coming to prophylactic use of colloids. So especially now we know, like main thing is the intravascular volume, like there is a hypovolemia in OHSS. So by giving the colloids, is there any role in secondary prevention of OHSS? So IV colloidal agents like albumin and hydroxyethyl starch can be given at the time of oocyte retrieval as a prophylactic intravascular volume and oncotic pressure enhancer to prevent the OHSS in high-risk patients. Yes, we can use this as a prophylactic measures, especially when you are during IVF, when you do the oocyte pickup, you can use this hydroxyethyl starch. So you can give on the day of OPU, depending upon the severity, you can give a daily for 2 or 3 days, or you can give alternate days also. And also if the risk is less, you can give only on the day of OPU. You can give hydroxyethyl starch. Albumin, we will use, albumin use is done only in severe cases, in moderate to severe cases, when it requires hospitalization and all. Regularly, we will use hydroxyethyl starch in a high-risk patient. So human albumin, it is 25%, that is 50 gram over 4 hours can be given. The risk mainly is allergic reactions and transmission of viruses and prions. So Cochrane 2011 says there is a limited evidence of benefit from intravenous albumin administration at the time of oocyte retrieval. So Cochrane doesn't say we have to give albumin for all patients on the day of OPO. That evidence is very limited. Only whenever there is an indication, when the patient has hypovolemia, when the patient has hypoproteinemia, and other complications like severe ascites and pleural effusion, then we'll go for albumin, but not regularly. But hydroxyethyl starch, yes, we use it regularly. Hydroxyethyl starch solutions, so it's an alternative to human albumin. It is a non-biological product with more molecular weight than human albumin. So 100 ml of 6% hydroxyethyl starch can be infused at a time of oocyte collection, followed by another 500 ml 48 hours. It is cheaper, potentially safer alternative to albumin. The cost is also less and allergic reactions are also less. So especially during oocyte pickup, when we see the estradiol value is more than 3000, or if it is more than 4000, and if we have obtained more than 15 oocytes, definitely after OPU, usually we give hydroxyethyl starch. And we will monitor the patient daily, and 48 hours also we will do the scan, see for the free fluid in the POD, or patient is developing any signs of OHSS. If it is like that, we will give one more dose of hydroxyethyl starch 48 hours later also. But definitely only with one dose, majority of the patients, they will not develop OHSS. Coming to metformin, the short-term co-treatment with metformin for patient with PCOS undergoing IVF ICSI does not improve the response to the stimulation, but significantly improves the pregnancy outcome, and it reduces the risk of OHSS. By using metformin, so many of the studies have shown by using metformin in a PCO patients, it has reduced the chances of OHSS. Coming to the role of metformin, so metformin alters the expression of both intra and extra ovarian angiogenic factor along with VEGF in the women with PCOS. It is started at least 5 weeks before OPU for maximum effect. So this was taken from a systemic review from a RBM online. So it is mainly alters the both intra and extra ovarian angiogenesis factor, especially it alters the VEGF, it reduces the VEGF factors when we give metformin. So coming to ovarian suppression. So ovarian suppression by using one is aromatase inhibitor, that is after OPU, after doing the oocyte retrieval, giving luteal phase letrose 2.5 mg. So it reduces the serum E2 level, it allows a faster recovery of LH concentration, and it prevents the OHSS. Can be used in oocyte donor and in patients in whom we are freezing all the embryos. So this letrozole can be used. So whenever the E2 is more than 4,500, usually after OPU we will give letrose 2.5 mg for 5 to 7 days, depending upon the E2 value on the day of trigger. So by giving letrozole, it reduces the serum E2 concentration, thereby indirectly reduces the OHSS occurrence. Coming to use of GnRH antagonist for ovarian suppression. So after oocyte retrieval or in a PCO, like for IUI TI cycle, if you are cancelling the cycle, so you can give GnRH agonist to cause the ovarian suppression also. So this giving GnRH antagonist, it is used in diagnosed severe OHSS cases. The GnRH antagonist was reinitiated for 1 week, and all the embryos are frozen. None of them progressed further or required hospitalization. So in one of the study, what they have done, in whenever the patient has high risk for OHSS and in severe OHSS also, they have, after oocyte retrieval, they have given GnRH antagonist continuously for 7 days. So and they have frozen all the embryos. So in majority of the cases who received GnRH antagonist, the severity of the OHSS has reduced and further progression was prevented. So usually it is given in the dose of 0.25 mg per day. Sometimes in severe cases, we can give 2 injections, that is 0.5 mg per day. Coming to the role of corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are anti-inflammatory. They have an anti-inflammatory effect. Has been hypothesized to beneficial for the prevention of OHSS. Treatment with methylprednisolone appears to reduce the risk of OHSS. Methylprednisolone 60 mg per day starting on the day 6 of stimulation and then tapering after the first pregnancy test, that is day 13 after embryo transfer, can be done. So usually we don't prescribe this steroids unless and until it is severe. So coming to the calcium infusions. So by giving calcium infusion, one is it inhibits the cyclic KMP synthesis and also cyclic KMP dependent renin secretions from the juxtaglomerular cells in the kidney. So it reduces the renin, it reduces the angiotensin II synthesis. Thereby, it reduces angiotensin II mediated synthesis of VEGF. By giving calcium infusion, it reduces the synthesis of VEGF, thereby reducing the Thereby, it prevents the increased vascular permeability and third space fluid loss. So calcium infusion, that is 10 ml of 10% in 200 ml of NS, can be infused IV on the day of oocyte retrieval and for 3 days thereafter. So usually it is not, the evidence is not very good quality evidence. So we don't routinely use calcium infusions. Only if it is required, we will use it, but not regularly and not routinely. And coming to dopamine agonist, it is commonly used whenever we are suspecting OHSS. Dopamine agonist, that is cabergoline, it inactivates the VEGF receptors by preventing phosphorylation of VEGF2 receptors. Thereby, and also it reduces the release of vasoactive angiogenic agents. So one is it reduces the angiogenic agent concentration, and it also inactivates the receptors. Thereby, this dopamine agonist has a role in prevention of OHSS. So usually it is given in the dose of 0.5 mg daily from the day of HCG trigger for 6 to 7 days, especially like it is given up to 6 days post oocyte retrieval. So dopamine agonists have a positive effect on OHSS signs and symptoms such as peritoneal fluid or ascites, abdominal distension and discomfort. It is known to reduce the symptoms like mainly like because of ascites as well as pleural effusion, and also the fertilization rate, implantation and ongoing pregnancy rates are not affected by use of dopamine agonist during ART treatment. So dopamine agonist can be used safely whenever we are suspecting OHSS for a second, and we can use it as a safer drug for secondary prevention. So dopamine agonist and GnRH antagonist, when given together at the time of diagnosis of OHSS, appears to work rapidly and effectively to diminish the clinical symptoms of the disease. So these two are the very important drugs whenever you are suspecting OHSS. Even for TI cycle, even for IUI cycle, if you are suspecting OHSS, you can use these two drugs, that is dopamine agonist and GnRH agonist. Both of them, when used together, they have worked very rapidly and effectively and have reduced the clinical symptoms of OHSS. So dopamine agonist use when women with polycystic ovaries are less responsive to cabergoline compared to those without PCO, most probably due to decreased production of dopamine and dopamine receptor expression in PCO patients. So and also dopamine agonists, they cannot prevent the late onset OHSS. One thing is they can be used as a secondary prevention measures, especially in the early onset OHSS. But in late onset OHSS is mainly because of endogenous HCG. So in those cases, it doesn't have much role. Coming to giving low dose aspirin as a secondary preventive measures. So one is activated platelets leads to release of multiple mediators, especially serotonin, PDGF, histamine, and LPA. So VEGF levels in OHSS strongly correlate with the platelet activation. So lipophosphatidic acid has been found to mediate expression of expressive interleukin 6 and 8 secretions from multiple corpus luteum of superovulated ovaries. So one thing is by giving low dose aspirin, this platelet activations will be prevented, and also release of various interleukins as well as the histamines and vasoactive substances will be prevented. So thereby low dose aspirin has a role. So in the study, what they have concluded in the study was, so in 1,503 cycles, they were randomly selected. The patients undergoing IVF cycles, so half of them, that is around 1,500 cycles, they were randomly selected for low dose aspirin treatment starting from day 1 of controlled ovarian hyperstimulation compared to no treatment. This was the one study which we had taken, which was published in Fertility Sterility 2010. So the clinical outcome, the conclusion of the study was based on our preliminary results. Introduction of low-dose aspirin therapy during ovulation induction for prevention of OHSS in high-risk patients should be considered, because they have studied in 1,500 cycles that given low-dose aspirin to prevent OHSS. So I have given the reference. If you want, you can just download the detailed study and you can go through it. So coming to the embryology strategies. So what are the other things we can do from in the embryology side, these are the medications which are in our hand, which we can give and prevent the onset of OHSS, or these are secondary preventive methods. So what are the other methods which can be done? One is from embryology strategies. Instead of day 3 transfer, we can go for blastocyst transfer. Depending on like a degree of OHSS can be assessed, we'll have extra days, extra 2 days of time in our hand. So we can assess whether the OHSS is more, whether it is worsening, whether the patient is developing more symptoms or not. We can assess the degree of OHSS. And also by doing the blastocyst transfer, usually we transfer 1 or 2, it reduces the multiple pregnancy. So when these things, the blastocyst transfer is whenever we are planning for fresh transfer, if we go for a fresh blastocyst transfer, these are the advantage. One is the extra time, so we can assess the degree of OHSS, and also we can transfer 1 or 2, thereby reducing the chances of multiple pregnancy. We can go for a single very good blastocyst transfer, so it reduces the multiple pregnancy and reduced late onset OHSS chances, and also success rate will be more when we go for a blastocyst transfer. The other things what we can consider from an embryology point of view is cryopreservation of all embryos and oocytes. Whenever we are suspecting OHSS, so do or freeze all strategies. So don't do the fresh transfer. So give all the measures to control this OHSS, and later after 1 or 2 months we can do the frozen embryo transfer. And also the other strategy is in vitro maturation, that will be discussed in detail by our embryologist. Coming to embryo freezing for prevention of ovarian hyperstimulation, the Cochrane 2009, it says, so the updated review has shown that there is insufficient evidence to support routine cryopreservation and insufficient evidence for relative merits of intravenous albumin versus cryopreservation. So in the study, what they have done is, when cryopreservation was compared with intravenous human albumin administration, no difference was found in all outcomes examined between the two groups. So here 2 groups were there. In that, what they have done is, in one group they have done the cryopreservation, freeze all embryo. In other group they have given intravenous albumin. So they have told there is no such difference. So when elective cryopreservation of all embryo was performed with frozen embryo with fresh embryo transfer, no difference was found in outcome examined between the group. So according to the Cochrane reviews and different studies, they have told it doesn't have much value, freezing the embryos in all the cases. So especially whenever there is a high risk for OHSS, freezing all embryos and then doing frozen embryo transfer definitely has the evidence, but not in poor responders and normal responders. So the ideal protocol to prevent OHSS, what is the ideal protocol? One is you can do a pre-treatment with oral contraceptive pills in a severe PCO patients. Use only low dose of gonadotropins. Use GnRH antagonist to prevent the LH surge. Go for an antagonist cycle rather than GnRH agonist cycle. So whenever you are giving trigger, always avoid HCG when you are suspecting hyperstimulation. Go for GnRH agonist trigger. And also don't give HCG for luteal phase support. Give progesterone for luteal phase support. So coming to the current clinical guidelines and summary of the most recent evidence of OHSS prevention strategies. So exposure, like decreasing the exposure to gonadotropins by using chronic low dose protocol and limited ovarian stimulation, mild stimulation protocols, and also no FSH on the day of HCG. So the level of evidence is very good, level 1B, 2A, and this thing you can just go through it. It is in all the textbooks. And also GnRH antagonist, yes, the level of evidence is very good. By giving GnRH antagonist, it decreases the risk of severe OHSS, reduces the incidence of OHSS, it reduces hospital administration, reduces admissions, reduces the need for secondary prevention such as posting or cycle cancellation. And also the third method is reducing the dose of HCG for triggering the ovulation. Yes, it appears to reduce the severity of OHSS, but larger RCTs are required. The level of evidence is 2A. And also, like, this table is very much important. It can come as a short note question or a long question in your main exams. And also, like, the other measures is doing intra-IVM. IVM, it has a promising but no data on OHSS prevention is available yet. And avoiding HCG for luteal phase support definitely approximately half of reduces the risk to 50%, and with progesterone for LPS compared to HCG. The level of evidence is 1A, it is very good evidence. So avoid HCG for luteal phase support. And also, what is the evidence of insulin sensitizing agents like metformin? Metformin reduces the risk of OHSS in women with PCO undergoing ovulation induction or IVF, may reduce the risk of moderate to severe OHSS in normal responders. The level of evidence is 1A and 2A. And cycle cancellation. Cycle cancellation almost eliminates the risk of OHSS in non-suppressed cycles. Ovulation may still occur and ensuing pregnancy could lead to development of late OHSS. Sometimes what happens in TI or IUI cycle, we may tell like we will cancel the cycle. We will tell the patient not to have sexual intercourse or anything. Sometimes by chance, if they have, there is a chances of multiple pregnancy and late onset OHSS. So whenever you're canceling the cycle, cancel when lot of intermediates are there, like the follicles are between 12 to 15 only. So if you cancel the cycle at when the follicle is at 17 18 spontaneous ovulation can happen. So whenever you are suspecting more intermediate cycle, cycle cancellation should be little bit early. Tell the patient about complete abstinence. When you're canceling the cycle, you can use GnRH antagonist to prevent the severity. You can give cabergoline. Monitor them daily by scans, by observing for the symptoms, or at least alternate days. You can monitor with serum. You can check the E2 values, and also you can check for any signs of hemoconcentrations. So always, whenever you are canceling the cycle, cancel whenever the follicles are in the intermediate size only, because spontaneous ovulation can happen if the follicles are 17 to 18 and strict abstinence and antagonist and dopamine agonist cabergoline has to be given so that it prevents the severity. And coming to the coasting appears to it reduces the severity of OHSS, but it does not eliminate OHSS. The incidence of severe OHSS in high-risk patients compared with expected values. No placebo controlled trials or RCTs. So optimal criteria and protocol remains to be determined, because the number of RCTs are very less. So we doesn't know like how many days we have to do costing, and all that criteria has to be set in till, but definitely it reduces the severity in high risk patient. Coming to the other medications like GnRH antagonist, GnRH agonist, definitely it has a role in reducing the OHSS. Using recombinant human LH for the trigger. Okay, recombinant LH we can use as a trigger, but the thing is it is very costly. It appears to be effective in reducing the incidence of OHSS, but associated with poor poor outcomes and high cost. And in some case, in some part of India, it may not be available commercially. So that also reduces the risk, and also cryopreservation of all the embryos. The evidence is insufficient, and also the antagonist salvage, albumin, starch, follicular aspiration, everything has a role in reducing the severity, as well as aromatase inhibitor. No literature on the effect of aromatase inhibitor on the incidence or severity of OHSS. Still, large-scale randomized control trials has to be done. Only we are using aromatase inhibitor is because few studies where less number of patients are used. So they have told like by reducing the E2 value, it has reduced the OHSS. Still, the large-scale, large randomized control studies has to be done regarding letrose. And dopamine agonist definitely has a role in reducing the OHSS, and also steroids. Regarding steroids, there is a conflicting results. May be effective when used at an early stage of ovarian stimulation. Level is evidence 2A. So this is in summary about the secondary preventive methods, especially in the Viva or in the short notes or in the long case. They can ask you regarding the level of evidence. So you should know all these things. What is the evidence at present? Coming to the management, one is two approach. One is pathogenesis oriented, like earlier they used to do like by giving indomethacin, by using AC inhibitors, by using pentoxifilin, so that each of the medications reduces the vasoactive substance. So this pathogenesis oriented treatment is not routinely done. So coming to the VEGF receptor antagonist, treatment with VEGF receptor antagonist has prevented and reduced the capillary permeability in OHSS rat models. This was studied in the animals. So coming to the management wise, whenever a patient comes with the symptoms of abdominal distension, nausea, vomiting, always first take a proper history. Just ask them what medications, just ask them the medication details, scan findings, and what are the injections which was given, what was the dose, how many doses they have given, whether they have taken HCG trigger, what was the dose of HCG, all the things you have to document it. And also do a general physical examination, check the patient's vitals and whether they have any respiratory symptoms, whether there is ascites or not. Do this scan and check for the ovary size. What is the number of the follicles? What is the size of the ovaries? Is there any free fluid? What is the amount of free fluid? Is there any evidence of ascites? All the things has to be documented when the patient comes. So coming to after that, we have to do the baseline investigations. So in the baseline investigations, as we have already discussed, we have to check for a hemoconcentrations, like we have to do the CBC, we have to do the creatinine, we have to do the LFT, check for the PT-APTT INR, and also see for the creatinine clearance, do the urine test, and daily monitoring of the weight gain, daily intake output has to be monitored, and also check for estradiol value. So all these things are the basic investigations which has to be done. And also coming to the management part, one is empirical management. Whenever there is a mild OHSS, we have to reassure, and symptoms usually resolves within 2 weeks of HCG administration. If it is a moderate OHSS, adequate fluid intake has to be checked, and also proper counseling is required. So in a outpatient management, whenever we are suspecting a mild OHSS, so what we have to do is daily we have to check the patient weight, we have to check for the intake output, we have to oral fluid intake should be maintained at no less than 1 liter per day. Usually we will tell the patient to have lot of fluids whenever we are doing OPD basis management. So more of fluid intake, that is minimum 3 liters, we tell minimum 3 liters of fluid intake should be done either in the form of water, buttermilk, juice, or protein shakes, whatever they want. They have to take more of fluids. And also in the diet, we'll ask them to take more of proteins in the form of egg white, protein powder. We can give protein biscuits, they can have dal, they can have sprouts. So all those things, they can have increased protein intake. And we will advise them to avoid strenuous physical activity should be avoided, as there is a risk of ovarian torsion. And also the patient is advised to check the weight daily, monitor the intake output daily properly. And also strict abstinence has to be advised. And also we have to educate them about warning the signs and symptoms. And also if there is any weight gain more than 1 kg per day, or if there is any decreasing urinary frequency, should prompt repeated physical examination, ultrasound, and laboratory evaluation, including hematocrit value, electrolytes, and serum creatinine values. In a symptomatic patient, if they have abdominal distension, pain and all, we can give analgesics, usually paracetamol or opioids. Usually we give tramadol. So, and also we avoid NSAIDs in few cases, and also we can give antiemetic like metoclopramide and ondansetron. Coming to medical management, what are the medications which we have to avoid, especially NSAIDs, because they affect the renal function. We try to avoid giving NSAIDs. Instead, we use tramadol. So compared and diuretics, it is used only when there is a pulmonary edema. If the patient has ascites or anything, simply don't use diuretics. So diuretics should be used only in case of pulmonary edema. Never use diuretics before proper intravenous volume replacement. So always whenever there is an if the intravascular volume is already depleted, if you give diuretics, what happens? Still the hypovolemia gets worsened. They will go for DIC early. So over enthusiastic diuretic treatment will worsen hypovolemia and hemoconcentration, and it increases the risk of thromboembolism. So always do a follow-up, OPD follow-up. Usually we do it daily, or at least every second day we have to do the follow-up. with the blood test and ultrasound examination. Any worsening symptoms like decrease in urinary output, significant weight gain, may be the first warning sign of accumulation of ascitic fluid and worsening of hemoconcentration. So hospitalization is required whenever there is a severe pain abdomen, intractable nausea, vomiting that prevents ingestion of the food and adequate fluids, severe oliguria and urea, tense ascites if they have dyspnea, tachypnea, and if there is a hypotension, dizziness and syncope. If there is an electrolyte imbalance like hyponatremia, hyperkalemia, if there is any signs of hemoconcentration or abnormal liver function test, it requires hospitalization. So monitoring in the hospital, we have to check the vitals every 2 to 8 hours according to the clinical status, measure the weight daily, complete physical examination, daily avoid bimanual examination of the ovaries due to risk of ovarian rupture, monitor the abdominal circumference at the navel, monitor daily, monitoring of fluid intake and output, ultrasound examination for ascites, ovarian size, repeated as necessary to guide the management, or if it is severe, if the patient has a lot of symptoms, we can go for paracentesis. And also evaluation include chest x-ray or 2D echo when pleural or pericardial effusion is suspected. So use a pulse oximeter and always check for SpO2 level for the patient with symptoms of pulmonary compromise, and complete blood count daily or more often as needed to guide the fluid management. Electrolytes has to be checked daily. Serum creatinine or creatinine clearance has to be checked. Urine specific gravity repeated as necessary, and liver enzymes repeated as necessary. So coming to the management, one is fluid management, second is anticoagulant therapy, third is ascitic drainage. Coming to fluid management, crystalloids, normal saline with or without glucose is the crystalloid of choice due to tendency for hyponatremia. So 1.5 to 3 liters should be the daily volume infused, and there should have to be a balance. And also fluid restriction can be done to minimize the ascites. Always we will monitor intake output, and we will calculate is there any fluid excess or a fluid deficit. Depending upon that, IV fluids can be titrated, and fluid replacement to improve the hemoconcentration and thromboembolism. We should be very cautious. We should not give more fluids also, more crystalloids also, because if we give more crystalloids, what happens? Again, third space loss, ascites, pleural effusion worsens. If we give less fluids, what happens? Hemoconcentration again deteriorates, and there will be thromboembolism. So adequate fluid replacement with crystalloids daily is required. And also we have to monitor the fluid balance. Monitor the fluid balance by one is urinary output, oral and IV fluid intake, daily weight check we have to do, abdominal girth we have to check, and also repeatedly do the hematocrit value and serum electrolytes, and we have to balance the fluids. What is the role of plasma expanders? One is whenever adequate fluid balance cannot be restored with crystalloids alone, then plasma expanders should be utilized. So this plasma, especially the starts, are very good in OHSS. They control very well. They increase the intravascular volume very early. So 6% solution of isotonic NaCl. So maximum daily doses 33 ml per kg per day can be administered. Slow administration has to be done to avoid lung congestion. And also the role of albumin. Albumin is used whenever there is a hypoalbuminemia. Should definitely be started when ascitic fluid is punctured, because this causes huge loss of protein. Risk of hepatitis and renal function disorders are there. Albumin use is whenever there is a whenever the albumin concentration is less, or whenever you are doing ascitic fluid tap. In a paracentesis cases, whenever you are doing ascitic fluid tap, along with albumin cover, we have to do it. So coming to anticoagulants, low molecular weight heparin preparations are preferably given, primarily in all cases of severe OHSS with hospitalization, but certainly we have to give in these patients without fail whenever there is a clinical signs of thromboembolic complications. So whenever there is a documented thrombophilia, if there is any history of hypercoagulability or thromboembolism, so uncorrected hemoconcentration after 48 hours of usual intravenous therapy. Suppose if there is a hemoconcentration, you have administered the crystalloids, you have given starch. Even after that, if the hemoconcentration is not corrected for 2 days, then definitely start with low molecular weight heparin, because chances of thromboembolism is more. So, and also give a full length venous support stockings. So avoid complete bed rest. Ambulation is required. So as a prevention of thromboembolic complication, especially in patients who are immobilized due to obesity or any other reasons, low dose aspirin administration should be done. So coming to abdominal compartment syndrome. So this is mainly because of increased intra-abdominal pressure more than 20 to 25 milligram mm of Hg with organ dysfunction. They will have a triad. One is respiratory compromise, mainly because of elevation of diaphragm and pleural effusion. Patient will have respiratory like breathing difficulties and all. Second, because of abdominal compartment syndrome, there is a decrease in venous return. Compression of IVC, impending blood return to the heart, they can cause hypotension. And one more thing is intestinal obstruction because of compression of viscera. These are the things whenever there is an increased intra-abdominal pressure, these things can happen. So paracentesis we have to do. So the renal effects include decreased renal artery resistance and improved GFR and ultimately increased urine production 65%. By doing paracentesis, what are the advantage of doing the paracentesis? By doing paracentesis, we are reducing the intra-abdominal pressure. So by reducing the intra-abdominal pressure, the blood flow to the kidney increases. So thereby what happens, there is increase in glomerular GFR. So ultimately there is increase in urine production, 65% increase in urine production within 1 day of fluid removal. And also pulmonary symptoms, including severe respiratory compromise, they are improved. So by doing paracentesis, their breathing difficulties and also they start reducing. And also hemoconcentration is decreased in OHSS patient after paracentesis with hematocrit and leukocyte counts significantly lowered. And also intravenous increased venous return and increase in cardiac output. It prevents hypovolemia and there is no adverse effect on pregnancy, and paracentesis could be beneficial because it increases uterine perfusion also. So whenever the patient has tense ascites, always go for paracentesis under albumin cover because it has lot of advantage. So paracentesis is performed gradually. Maximum 4 liters can be tapped over 12 hours. 1 liter of ascitic fluid with 1 liter, usually 3 to 3.5 gram of albumin is lost. So we have to administer daily 30 to 50 gram of albumin. If whenever there is a pleural effusion, we have to go for thoracocentesis also. Coming to indication of surgery in OHSS, indications are mainly whenever there is an intraperitoneal hemorrhage because of rupture of ovarian cyst. So the ovaries are enlarged when the ovaries are ovarian cysts are ruptured. If there is an intraperitoneal hemorrhage, then we have to go for surgery. And also whenever we are suspecting adnexal torsion, ovarian torsion, we have to do surgery. And also laparoscopic surgery is preferred. Avoid laparotomy. Try to preserve the ovaries at the maximum cost. So hemoconcentration or ascites by giving crystalloids and albumin, relative hemodilution. So diuresis, and also there is a recovery. And also in a tense ascites cases, so by in a tense ascites cases, there is an impaired renal function. So in those cases, we can give crystalloids, albumins, paracentesis, ICU care, and dopamine drip can be given. So whenever usually they will have diuresis and recovery. If there is any problem, in spite of all these measures, if the patient is going for renal failure, if the patient is going for ARDS, if there is any thrombophilic phenomena, we can consider in late onset OHSS, termination of pregnancy can be considered only in severe cases, but not in all cases. Pregnancy after OHSS. The pregnancy rate in patients with OHSS is higher than average. This is because the patients are usually young women in their first ART cycles with many oocytes and good quality embryos. Several authors have reported an increase in early pregnancy loss in OHSS patients. So this is in short, I've covered the treatment of OHSS. You can refer to one is Green Top guidelines, RCOG guidelines, and also ASRM guidelines, and also you can refer the standard textbooks. So, and you can make a notes today only, make a flow chart, whichever you're comfortable, whichever way you're comfortable expressing, because this question will come either in your practicals, either in your theory. So whatever doubts is there, you can just clarify. I'll just discuss two important cases. So these cases, day-to-day practice will come across during ovulation induction.
It's better to give metformin for all patients.
Whenever we are suspecting.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, ma'am. I'll just discuss the interesting cases also.
Okay.
Just 1 second. Then I'll get back. So this case already we had discussed during use of gonadotropins. So I'll just highlight it here once more. So Mrs. A, aged 28 years, presented to the OPD with history of abdominal distension, heaviness, breathlessness since 2 days. On taking details history, following details were noted. So white menstrual cycle was irregular, once in 1.5 months to 2 months, suggesting like anovulatory cycles. So LMP was 20 days back, and past medical history, she had history of urticaria on and off, history of appendicectomy in childhood, and also there was history of laparoscopic ovarian drilling for PCO 1 year back. And also in the family history, father had hypertension, mother was hypothyroid, she had bronchial asthma, and no history of infertility. And treatment history, she had underwent many cycles of
Madam,
ovulation.
there is no screen sharing.
Just 1 second, ma'am. Just 1 second. Ma'am, are you able to see the screen now?
No, ma'am.
No,
No.
No, ma'am.
no.
Just 1 second. Ma'am, at present, are you able to see?
No.
No. Just 1 second, ma'am. Screen sharing is not happening, it seems. Ma'am, I've shared the screen. Can you just check it? Are you able to see the screen?
No,
No, madam.
slides are visible, Dr. Nish.
No.
I can't see any slides. No.
No slides are seen.
Okay, ma'am. This.
You can see now, ma'am.
Yeah, now we can see.
Okay, ma'am. Okay. So this patient was 28 years, female, presented with abdominal distension, heaviness, breathlessness since 2 days. Menstrual history, it suggests anovulatory cycles, and past history of laparoscopic ovarian drilling for PCO 1 year back. So treatment cycle, she underwent many cycles of ovulation induction with clomiphene citrate and letrose since 2 years. So details were not available. In this cycle, ovulation induction was done with letrose and gonadotropin. It was done outside. During treatment cycle itself, she had developed abdominal bloating and distension. So her baseline ultrasound showed bilateral PCO, uterus was normal, AFC was 16 to 18 on both sides, and ovarian volume was on the right ovary, it was 22, on the left ovary, it was 19 cc. And her LH, baseline LH was more, which was 11, FSH was 4.8, AMH was also more. So her examination finding was normal, and also slight rhonchi was present on systemic examination. So per abdomen, it was soft, slightly tender, abdominal girth was 94 centimeter. So, and also like patient was admitted for further management. And on the scan, she had multiple follicles which were enlarged with free fluid in the POD, and also it suggested there was ascites. So this was the scan findings during the stimulation which was done. On day 3, they started with letrose 2.5 mg BD, that is 5 mg per day for 5 days. And HMG injection 75 was used on day 3, day 5 and day 7. On 9th day, the follicles were 12, 11 and multiple follicles on the right ovary. Even on the left ovary, 13 and 12 mm follicle was there. So HCG was in, HMG injection was increased to 150 international units. It was given daily for 3 days. From 75 directly, it was increased to 150. And on 12th day, there were 3 follicles on the right ovary, that is 15, 14, and 13, and multiple follicles. And on the left ovary, there were like 13, 12, 11, and multiple small follicles. And again, HCG 150 was continued for 2 more days. Same high dose was given, even when there are 3 intermediate follicles on both the ovaries. So on 14th day, there was almost like almost 4 follicles on the right ovary, which was 17, 16, 15, and 12 in size, and also 4 follicles on the left ovary. Again, the HMG was given, that is 75 units was given in spite of multiple intermediate follicles. On day 15, the follicles were 20 mm, 18 mm, 17, and 14, 11 on the right ovary. Almost 3 follicles are dominant in the right ovary and 1 intermediate in the right ovary. And on the left ovary, 18 and 16, 2 dominants in the left ovary and 2 intermediates in the left ovary. Totally, almost they have 5 dominant follicles and 3 to 4 intermediate follicles. And also there was a free fluid in the POD. Still, HCG trigger was given to this patient. So, and after 2 days, she landed up with symptoms of breathlessness, abdominal pain, distension, and all. So in this case, one learning factor is what are the things which has to be avoided. One is patient selection. She is a PCO patient and her previous stimulation protocol details were not there. So during this, whenever we are doing the stimulation, better we should have started with chronic low dose step-up protocol. Okay, started with very low dose. Either whenever you don't have a data, start with either 37.5, give it for 7 days, and then increase, like observe the scan findings, whether they are responding or not responding. If they're not responding, then only we have to increase the dose. If they are responding, continue with the low dose itself. Like after giving 75, just 1 second. 75 on 9th day, the dose was increased to 150, that is daily. That is a wrong thing. We shouldn't do that. So already she is responding. Why we have to increase it? We shouldn't increase the dose. We should continue that. And also on day 12 only, like intermediate follicles were more. Then only we should have counseled the patient that multiple follicles are developing and we should have stopped giving HMG injection. She should have HMG injection should not have been given. Then only we should patient should have been counseled for chances of OHSS and cycle cancellation. Just withholding the gonadotropins, and it has to be that has to be like patient was supposed to be just observed. Even on day 14, when so many intermediate follicles are there, still HMG was given in spite of 5 to 6 dominant follicles and 4 intermediate follicles. So HCG trigger was given. This is a mistake. Whenever you are seeing this is only for TI or IUI cycle, so this many follicles are not required. So on day 12 to day 14 only, the cycle should have been cancelled. Ideally on day 12 only, the cycle should have been cancelled. So, but still the cycle was continued and HCG was given. So on admission, the patients, all the baseline investigation was done, and GnRH antagonist 0.5 mg was given daily for 7 days, and letrozole was given to reduce the E2 value, and cabergoline was started, and patient was given IV crystalloids to correct the hemo concentration, and also she was given head starch. And daily our scans was monitored for ascites and all, and once ascitic tap was performed for this patient with albumin cover. This patient recovered after 1 ascitic tap with albumin cover, and rest of the medications are, luckily the renal parameters were normal. Renal dysfunction and DIC did not happen. And also she was started with low molecular weight heparin, and she was monitored. Within 7 days, she recovered well. So this kind of cases, you think like these are the simple thing, they will not hyper respond. We will do the stimulation in our daily OPDs. So we should be very cautious when we are doing stimulation for especially a PCO patients. So because in this medical legal era, they can sue you for anything, like for hyperstimulation and all, if they go for hospital administration and all, admission and all. So it becomes very difficult. So always, whenever you are suspecting a hyperstimulation, always counsel the patient, take adequate measures, increase the fluid intake, increase the protein intake. Tell them the cycle, we may have to cancel the cycle. Suppose in this patient on day 12 only, if you are if this finding was there, you should have counseled the patient, stop this, don't give gonadotropins. You could have started GnRH antagonist, you could have started cabergoline, and increase the fluid intake, increase the protein intake, and monitored regularly. So if that step was done on day 12 only, the chances of onset of OHSS as well as hospital admission could have been prevented. So always be cautious whenever you're doing stimulations. So, and one more case, this case came to us 3 years back. This cycle was cancelled. Later, she conceived with only Letro's low dose injections. So, and also like we get so many patients only with clomiphene citrate, only they are hyperstimulated, and they refer to us for further management from peripheries. So always be cautious. So whenever you're giving clomiphene citrate or gonadotropin, simply don't just give the medications and leave it. Always get the follicular scan done, or you by yourself only do the follicular scan, because a radiologist will do a transabdominal scan. They will not have any idea about how many intermediate follicles are there and all. Even the intermediate follicles also secrete C2 value. So always you only do the follicular scan. Take each follicle measurements, even it is less than 10 mm. How many are there less than 10 mm? You take into consideration, because that will give you a value how much may be the probable E2 value for this patient. So always better you do the follicular monitoring always whenever you are doing a ovulation induction. So, and this case, it came to us 3 years back. It is very interesting, I'll tell you. And there's a lot of complications happened. So the stimulation was done in a second tier city, and she was referred when she had developed the symptoms. So there's Mrs. B, aged 32 years, presented to the OPD with history of abdominal distension, heaviness, breathlessness since 1 day. Oocyte retrieval was done 1 day back outside, and on taking detailed history, following details were noted. So wife menstrual cycle was irregular. She was a PCO patient, and past medical history, nothing significant was there. Even in family history, mother and elder sister had irregular cycles. And treatment history, she had underwent many cycles of ovulation induction with CC Letros, and also she had undergone 5 cycles of ovulation induction with IUI with Letros and gonadotropins, and gonadotropin dose was around 75 to 150 international units. 6 to 7 doses were given in different cycles, and in between few cycles were cancelled mainly because of poor follicular growth. And this cycle she underwent IVF stimulation using a long GnRH agonist protocol, and HCG Ovitrol was given. So they had given Ovitrol trigger, that is they had given 2 ampules of Ovitrol. So 35 oocytes were obtained for this patient. So the next day only she had all these symptoms, and previous investigation showed bilateral polycystic ovaries in the scan, and baseline LH was more and AMH was 9.6. So on examination when she came, she had tachycardia, like BP was 110 by 80 luckily. SpO2 was already 95%, respiratory rate was 28. On examination she had basal Krebs, and also on per abdomen there was a fluid distension as well as abdomen was tender, and weight gain was, abdominal girth was also increased from 2 days. And also she was admitted in the ICU for further management. On admission, what happened, like all the initial investigations were done, and there was features suggestive of hemoconcentration. So for this patient, alternate days ascitic tap was done with albumin cover. So still, even after ascitic tap, even with crystalloids, even with albumin infusion, so the even with GnRH antagonist was given 0.5 mg daily, and agonist like cabergoline was also started, and also patient was started with low molecular weight heparin and continuous intake output. Everything was monitored in ICU. But after 2 ascitic tap, the patient hemoglobin started reducing, and also feature of hemoperitoneum started, and also the patient's ovary size started increasing when it was monitored in the ultrasound. So, and also patient started having acute pain abdomen. So, and also like when they had done just a diagnostic tap to check whether why the hemoglobin is dropping, they have noted hemoperitoneum also, and also ended up in DIC. So luckily the patient, after transfusion of fresh frozen plasma with albumin infusions with hemoglobin, her hemoglobin improved, her BP improved, and hemodynamically she became stable, and laparoscopy was done. The hemoperitoneum and all the site of the follicular cyst structured, whatever the bleeding point, it was coagulated. Hemoperitoneum was drained, and also whichever the larger cyst were, larger follicular cyst were there, cyst aspiration was also done. Her E2, even giving all these medications, E2 also was increasing. So after that laparoscopy, after the drainage and all, after giving FFPs, blood transfusions, luckily patient's hemodynamically, she improved, and almost she was in ICU for 25 days, and later she recovered. So especially whenever you are doing a IVF stimulation, be careful about trigger what you are giving, especially if you are using a long GnRH agonist protocol. You have to give HCG trigger only. There is no choice. Anything, if any problem would have happened, they would have sued the doctor, and all lot of complications will happen. Especially be cautious when you are doing stimulations. Always go for GnRH agonist protocol in those PCO patients, and use GnRH agonist protocol on GnRH agonist trigger only. So you will be safe. Almost 60 to 70% chances of developing OHSS is prevented in that. So even if OHSS develops, it will be a milder form of OHSS that can be controlled with the medications and IV crystalloids and albumin infusions only. So in IVF stimulation, be cautious about the gonadotropin dose, the protocol you use, and the trigger which you give. Okay. Is there any questions?
Madam, I got one question. How this antagonist to prevent the ovarian hyperstimulation?
Ma'am, one thing is they cause ovarian suppression of the ovaries. So rapid luteolysis, and also there is a decrease in E2 value, and also it has a role that it reduces VEGF also.
Okay.
Hello, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah, ma'am.
Ma'am, in the classification, they have given that estrogen more than 150, they have given, ma'am, and pregnenolone more than 10.
Ma'am, usually we don't follow that, ma'am. That is the oldest one.
Okay, ma'am. So we only look for the clinical signs.
Yeah, we'll see for the serum value, serum E2 value.
Oh.
Madam, is the ovarian hyperstimulation, does it repeat again the second, suppose if she
Yeah, ma'am.
conceives?
Yeah, it can recur because the factors are same, patient profile is same, our AMH is same, AFCs is same. So only thing is in the previous cycle, if she has like ended up in OHSS, we can do a mild stimulation protocol in the next cycles with precautions.
Okay.
Ma'am, if a patient has a single follicle after lateral stimulation, and if we give 10,000 international units HCG, is there any problem? Is there any chance that they can go into OHSS if they have a past history of?
If they have, ma'am, if they have lot of intermediate, suppose what they do radiologists when they do the scan, only the largest follicle they will measure and they will give. They will not tell you how many 12 mm follicles are there, how many 13 are there, how many 14 are there. Suppose if 13, 14, 15 mm follicles are more and the radiologist has not given, and if we have given 10,000, definitely they will land up in mild or moderate form of OHSS. 10,000 is not required. 5,000, the normal responders, 5,000 is sufficient.
Okay. Okay.
Ideally,
If they have
don't
previous
go
history
beyond
of
5,000.
DVT, if they have previous history of DVT and all, then we should limit the beta HCG. The
We
HCG.
should, one thing is if they have DIC and all previously, if they want ovarian stimulation now, we should be very cautious with IRIS consent, proper counseling. Then we have to do with a milder stimulation protocol. Start with oral agents. If it is for IVF, go with letrozole with HMG stimulations, very low dose stimulations. Try to aim for only 3 to 5 follicles. That's it. So after that, try
That
to.
is for IVF also, you're saying, ma'am, or only for the ovulation induction with the TI or IUI.
For IUI, usually going for DIC is very rare. Go for only if go for mild stimulation, ma'am. Aim for only one follicle. So
One
in
follicle.
early only, if you feel there are more intermediate follicles, cancel the cycle. Explain the patient, cancel the cycle.
Okay. Ma'am, if a patient has previous history of OHSS, second time when we are stimulating them, what will be our aim and how many follicles we should aim at, ma'am?
So one thing, it depends upon the previous stimulation protocols.
Okay.
So suppose what is the dose which they have used and all, we have to check. So start with low dose as much as possible. Suppose if it is a clomiphene citrate, start with only 50 mg. If it is a letro, start only with 2.5 mg for 5 days. Try to avoid gonadotropins if she is responding. So and
Even
also
for IVF, ma'am?
for IVF, we go for a mild stimulation protocols. We go for a mild stimulation antagonist protocols.
Antagonist.
Yeah, there we will use Letros 2.5 mg or 5 mg for 5 days, along with alternate days 150 international units of gonadotropins. So we will start antagonist once the follicle is around 12 to 14 mm in size.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
This agonist trigger, how much to be given, madam?
Ma'am, usually we give regularly lipid injection. Usually we give 2 mg. So, and also for IVF injection, we repeat after 12 hours, either 2 mg or 1 mg.
Okay.
Yeah. It comes as a 4 mg vial.
In the previous case, when you said you could have started Capgolin at day 12, so we are basically abandoning the cycle, right?
Yeah, even when we are abandoning the cycle, we can prevent the development of OHSS, ma'am. Because even in spite, even if we don't give the gonadotropins, the follicle might grow in size, and she might land it with OHSS also. These are the secondary preventive measures. So by giving antagonist, by giving cabergoline, we are suppressing the ovaries, and also we are suppressing the concentration of VEGF, so that vascular permeability and all is not increased.
Okay. So had we started, we will abandon the cycle, we'll start with Antag or Capgolin. Then how do we monitor them? I mean, how long we have to follow up and what to do for them, such
At
people?
least when we cancel the cycle, we will give this progesterones also, meprate suppression to suppress the ovaries also. We will start with meprate also. So we will give for ideally
At the same time?
Same time.
30 around day 12 only, we'll start with the
10 mg TID. We will give that also.
Okay.
Monitor at least daily or alternate days for the symptoms, abdominal girth, weight of the patient, and also patient's vitals and scan findings, ovary size, follicle size, ovary size, and free fluid.
Okay. Do they need to monitor with estradiol also?
Yes.
Yeah, E2 levels also?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So we will monitor them till they get their cycles?
Yes. Even in the next cycle also give a OCP, suppress, and then start.
Okay. Okay, ma'am.
Hello, madam.
Hello,
After
do you for only or
hello, ma'am. How much antibiotics you have to give?
Ma'am, we can give 0.25 to 5 mg, 0.5 mg.
Okay.
Madam, this letrozole and cabergoline, do you give on the day of HCG trigger or after OPU?
Ma'am, ideally after OPO, only if we are suspecting in very severe cases, like if the E2 value is more than 12,000 like that, in a few patients, we will start before on the day of HCG trigger also.
Okay, thank you.
Ma'am, if any further questions are there, you can put it in the group, ma'am. We will answer it. I think after 5 minutes, we can start with another session. That is also very much important.